I always thought my neighbor, Mr. Blackwood, was a strange man. Growing up, I would often see him sitting alone on his front porch, staring blankly into space with a creepy smile on his face. I would also notice the occasional person walking into his house, but they never seemed to come out. I brushed it off as just my overreactive imagination, until one night when I heard the screams. It was a cold and stormy night, and I was at home alone. I was sitting in my living room, engrossed in this scary movie, when suddenly I heard a blood-curdling scream pierce through the quiet neighborhood. At first, I thought it was just a scene from the movie, but the scream continued, getting louder and more intense. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just the wind playing tricks in my mind. But then, the scream turned into a cry for help, and I knew it was real. I quickly turned off the TV and opened my window, trying to locate the source of the screams. It was coming from Mr. Blackwood's house. Without thinking twice, I grabbed a flashlight and ran outside towards his house. As I approached his front door, I could feel my heart racing with fear and adrenaline. However, when I pressed my ear against the door, the screams suddenly stopped. It was all dead quiet. I hesitated for a moment, debating whether to knock on the door or just go back home. But before I could make a decision, the front door slowly creaked open. I shone my flashlight into the dark hallway, but there was no one there. I cautiously stepped inside, the musty smell hitting my nostrils. The house was eerily quiet, and I could feel an unsettling presence looming over me. I followed the sound of footsteps coming from upstairs, as if someone was rushing towards the bedroom. With each step, the floorboards creaked under my weight, making me feel like I was being watched. I reached the bedroom and slowly pushed the door open, my heart pounding in my chest. What I saw inside will forever haunt me. Mr. Blackwood was standing in front of the window, clutching a knife in his hand. But it wasn't the knife that made my blood run cold. It was the person laying on the bed, bound and gagged, with a look of pure terror in their eyes. It was my next-door neighbor, Mrs. Carmichael. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I had always thought Mr. Blackwood was a harmless but creepy man. I would have imagined him capable of such heinous acts. But before I could process everything, he turned around and faced me with that same creepy smile I had seen on his face countless times before. "Hello, my dear neighbor," he said, in a chillingly calm voice. "I've been expecting you." My mind was racing, trying to come up with an escape plan. But before I could move, he lunged towards me with a knife. I let out a scream and ran out of the room as fast as I could. I could hear his heavy footsteps chasing me after as I sprinted down the stairs, almost tripping in the process. I could feel his presence looming close behind me, his crazed laughter echoing through the house. I finally reached the front door and flung it open, running out into the storming night. I could hear him shouting and cursing behind me, but I didn't dare to turn around. I ran all the way to my house, my heart pounding in my ears. I locked all the doors and windows, trying to catch my breath and make sense of everything that had just happened. I couldn't believe my neighbor was a deranged murderer. I should have trusted my instincts all those years ago. But the horror wouldn't end there. For the rest of the night, I could hear strange noises coming from Mr. Blackwood's house. I could hear footsteps pacing around, doors slamming shut, and even more screams. And then, it all finally stopped. The next morning, I called the police and told them everything that had happened. They searched Mr. Blackwood's house, and what they found was beyond terrifying. The basement was filled with torture devices and the bodies of his victims. It turned out he had been luring people into his house for years, never letting them leave. Mr. Charmitchell was the lucky one. She had somehow managed to escape and run to my neighbor's house for help. Others were not so fortunate. I was lucky to have survived that night, and to have finally exposed Mr. Blackwood for the monster he truly was. But even though he was behind bars, I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was still not right. I would often catch glimpses of Mr. Blackwood staring at me through the prison bars, that same creepy smile never leaving his face. I couldn't help but wonder if it was still somehow haunting me from beyond the grave. But the worst of it all was the nightmares. Every night, I would dream of being trapped inside Mr. Blackwood's house, hearing the screams of his victims echoing through the walls. I would see his face, twisted into that same twisted smile as he chased me after with a knife. I became paranoid, constantly checking my locks and looking over my shoulder. I couldn't shake off the feeling that he was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike again. It wasn't until I moved away from that neighborhood and started therapy that the nightmares had finally stopped. To this day, I still shudder at the memory of that stormy night and the horrors that took place in my neighbor's house. It goes to show, you may never truly know what's hidden behind closed doors, and the people you think you know may be hiding dark secrets. Trust your instincts, because you never know. The creepy neighbor next door may be far more dangerous than you could ever imagine. I peered out of my window, watching as the sun slowly set behind the tall trees that lined on our quiet street. As the darkness crept in, a shiver ran down my spine. Lately, my once peaceful neighborhood had become a source of fear and unease. It all started about a week ago, when I found a small doll on my doorstep. At first, I thought it was a misplaced toy from one of the neighboring children. But as the days passed, more and more objects appeared on my doorstep. On the second day, it was a wilted flower with a note attached that read, "For you, my dear Fiona." I brushed it off as a strange prank, but when the third day brought a dead bird, my heart began to race with fear. Each day, the objects became creepier and more disturbing, from jar spiders to a rusty knife. I tried to ignore it, hoping that it would stop, but it only got worse. The objects became more frequent, appearing on my doorstep every morning without fail. And then, I started noticing a figure lingering in the shadows of my street, watching me as I went to collect my eerie gifts. I couldn't make it out who it was, but I could feel their eyes burning into me, a sinister presence that sent chills down my spine. I tried to talk to my neighbors and see if anyone else had been experiencing similar incidents, but they all seemed oblivious to what was happening. It was as if I was the only one being targeted. I started to fear leaving my house or even looking out of my window, but I couldn't escape the feeling of being watched. One day, I decided to confront whoever was tormenting me. I waited outside my door, determined to catch them in the act. As the clock struck midnight, I heard footsteps approaching. My heart raced with anticipation and fear as I watched the figure approach my doorstep. But to my surprise, it wasn't a stranger or some masked maniac. It was my neighbor, Mr. Benson. I stared at him in shock as he placed a small box on my doorstep and quickly scurried away. I didn't know what to make of it. I had never really spoken to Mr. Benson before, only exchanging polite greetings and small talk. But now, he was acting strange and leaving these bizarre gifts for me. I cautiously opened the mysterious box, half expecting to find something horrifying inside. But instead, it held a delicate porcelain doll, its face twisted into a menacing smile. Fear and confusion overwhelmed me as I realized that Mr. Benson was behind all of this. But why? The next morning, I decided to confront Mr. Benson and get some answers. I went over to his house and knocked on the door. He answered with a smile, but I could see the hint of something sinister in his eyes. I asked him about the gifts and why he was leaving them for me. He chuckled and invited me inside, claiming it was all just a harmless game. But as I stepped into his house, I realized it was anything but harmless. The walls were covered in photos of me, taken from my bedroom window while I was asleep. He had been watching me all this time, studying my every move. My heart pounded in my chest as he led me deeper into his house, showing off his collection of creepy objects, all with my name on them. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Mr. Benson had become obsessed with me, fixating getting my attention at any cost. He explained how he'd always noticed me in the neighborhood, and when he saw me find the first gift, he knew he had to keep going to make the gifts creepier and more aggressive for me to notice him. I filled with disgust and terror as he revealed his twisted plan to win my love. But when he started getting angry, accusing me of not appreciating his gifts and not giving him the attention he deserved, he grabbed my arm tightly, and I knew I had to get out of there before things escalated even further. I managed to break free from his grasp and make a run for the door, but he chased after me, calling my name and begging me to stay. I ran as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my ears as I made my way back to the house. I quickly locked all the doors and windows, hoping he wouldn't try to follow me. But the next morning, as I opened the door, I was met with a horrifying sight. My doorstep was covered in blood, and among the red stains were the pieces of my clothes, a lock of my hair, and a note from Mr. Benson proclaiming his love for me and his desire to be with me forever. I couldn't believe this was happening. I called the police and explained everything to them. They seemed Mr. Benson's house and found evidence of his twisted obsession with me. He was arrested and charged with stalking and harassment. But the fear and trauma he had caused me would never fully go away. I moved away from that neighborhood, unable to stomach the thought of living anywhere near Mr. Benson. But even now, I can't erase the memories of his sinister gifts and the terror of knowing I was being watched and targeted by my seemingly harmless neighbor. It's a reminder that sometimes the scariest things can come from the people we least expect. I never liked my new neighbor. From the moment she moved in, I could sense there was something off about her. Maybe it was the way she avoided any interaction with the other neighbors, or the way her cold, lifeless eyes would follow me whenever I walked past her house. Whatever it was It sent shivers down my spine. Being the curious person that I am, I couldn't help but investigate. My suspicions were confirmed when I saw her sneaking around in the middle of the night, carrying a gasoline canister and a matchbox. I quickly realized what she was up to. She was planning to burn down her own home. I couldn't believe it. Why would anyone would do such a thing? And why was she so secretive about it? I knew I had to do something to stop her. The next day, I went to the police and told them everything. They promised to look into it, but I wasn't sure they took me seriously. After all, I had no proof. I decided to keep an eye on my neighbor and gather evidence myself. Days turned into weeks, and I still didn't have any solid evidence. But then, one night, my dog started barking like crazy. I went to the window and saw my neighbor in the backyard, holding a large burlap sack. I quickly realized that she had snuck into my house in an attempt to frame me for her crimes. I called the police right away, and they arrived just in time to catch her red-handed. She was dragged away in handcuffs, screaming and struggling. But even as she was taken away, her eyes never left mine, filled with a deep hatred. The police searched her house and found a room with padded walls. Inside, they discovered disturbing evidence: newspaper clippings of house fires and missing persons, as well as a detailed plan of her twisted scheme to burn down her own home and frame me for it. It was clear that she had been planning for this for a long time. As the investigation continued, more disturbing details emerged. It seemed my neighbor had a long history of mental illness and a deep-seated resentment towards her previous neighbors. Some of them had mysteriously disappeared or their houses had burned down, but the police were never able to link it to her. The realization sent shivers down my spine. I couldn't believe that I was living next door to someone capable of such heinous acts. But what scared me the most, the thought that if I hadn't caught her in the act, I could have been her next target. My neighborhood breathed a collective sigh of relief when she was sentenced to life in a mental institution. But for me, the nightmare wasn't over. Every time I walked past her house, I couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched. I started having nightmares of her breaking into my house and lighting it on fire. I even started seeing her face in the shadows, looking around my property. No matter how much I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head, I couldn't shake off the fear. It was as if her malevolent presence had become a part of my life. One day, I woke up to find my house filled with the smell of gasoline. My heart raced as I frantically searched every room, but there was no sign of anyone being inside. I started to panic and called the police, but they found no trace of an intruder. As days went by, more strange incidents kept happening in my house. Things would go missing, and I would find them in odd places. Doors would open and close on their own. I started to believe that my neighbor's vengeful spirit was haunting me, seeking revenge for ruining her plans. I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to sell my house and move away from that cursed neighborhood. But as I was packing my things, I heard a knock on my door. My heart skipped a beat when I saw her standing on my porch. My neighbor, who was supposed to be locked up in a mental institution. She had an eerie smile on her face as she handed me a piece of paper. It was a restraining order against me, claiming that I had been stalking and harassing her. I was shocked and confused. How could she manipulate the legal system to turn the tables on me? I tried to fight back, but no one believed me. In their eyes, I was just a disturbed person who was obsessed with my neighbor. I was forced to leave my house and move into a small apartment in a different city. But even as I tried to start a new life, I couldn't shake off the feeling that my neighbor was still watching me, no matter where I went. I felt like as though her dark presence was following me. And then, one night, I woke up to finding my apartment filled with smoke. I stumbled out of my bedroom. I saw her standing in my living room, holding a lit match in her hand. She had finally found me. I screamed and ran out of the apartment, calling the police. By the time they arrived, the fire had engulfed my whole apartment. The firefighters were able to put out the flames, but everything I owned was destroyed. As I stood in the rubble of my life, I knew that I couldn't run for her anymore. She had followed me whenever I went, and now she had finally succeeded in destroying my life. Some say that she died in the fire along with her twisted revenge. But for me, she will always be alive in my nightmares, a constant reminder that true evil can lurk in the most unexpected places, even behind the doors of a seemingly normal neighbor.